The revolution is real, it's live, and as some comrades say, it's lit, right? Lit. The revolution is lit.
Uhuru Comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Olafini Kimba, the managing editor of the Burning Spear newspaper and a member of the African People's Socialist Party, and I will be your MC for this morning. Today's study is highly important, and we encourage you right now to share this stream, invite your friends and family to it so that as many of our people as possible can be involved in this discussion. This week, the chairman reads from his latest work, Vanguard, the Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, the political report to the party's 7th Congress, Chapter 4, titled The Deepening Crisis of Imperialism. You can find the study materials in the Facebook and YouTube descriptions. In this study, we finally get to hear not only an alternative explanation of the situation going on in the world, but we can hear the clear, sharp, scientific African internationalist analysis, which deepens our understanding of the nature of this parasitic social system and the basis for the havoc we see being created around the world. To understand this crisis is to understand that our task as revolutionaries is to deepen it, to advance the struggle for African liberation, to complete the Black Revolution of the 60s. In this study, Chairman deepens our understanding of the necessity of having our own theory, African internationalism, the worldview of the African working class. With these studies, we strive to churn out African working class intellectuals, one to the understanding that this world can be changed with our own hands and the practical implementation of our theory. We ask that you begin to prepare your questions regarding this topic so that the chairman can expound more on certain ideas. It is now my honor to introduce the theoretician behind African internationalism, the author of Vanguard, an unrelenting African freedom fighter who revived the Black Revolution and has deepened the crisis of imperialism through his efforts tenfold. My leadership, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Uhuru.
Uhuru, brothers and sisters and comrades, I want to express my appreciation to everybody coming out to this study this morning. And I know for the last several weeks we've been dealing with the issue of dialectical and historical materialism, working immediately from the works of Maurice Cornforth, whose book, Materialism and the Dialectical Method, was the guide for how the discussion went, although in most instances we challenge much of what Cornforth had to say, but it gave us a great backdrop to deepen that discussion and help people understand the question of dialectic and historical materialism. In addition, what we did during that time was we would use also the political report to our Congresses, certainly the 7th Congress and to some extent the 6th Congress political report, because we wanted to make sure that this was not perceived and understood and received simply as some kind of purely abstract issue, discussion, that we wanted people to be able to see the practical significance, practical implications of utilization of this method of investigation and analysis that we know as dialectical materialism. Today, what we're going to do is go directly to Vanguard, which is the title of the book that came from the political report to our 7th Congress. And we think it's important to do that because there's so much swirling around us that is fighting for the attention of most of the people. And we want people to understand this. And this is, by the way, a continuation of this discussion of dialectical materialism by another means, by another method, if you will. We want to do this because right now there are many people who we've heard, we've seen, who concluded in our own communities, even in laundromats and supermarkets, we hear people talking about how Trump is going to be impeached and finally we got him, and what this means, they think, for our situation as a people facing this person who has come to represent this dreaded feature of our history in terms of just the callous, open, naked kind of white nationalist aggression. And so people that we've experienced since we first met Europe, since the first Europeans set foot on the continent of Africa and forced an African to do something against our will, that ultimately resulted in the balkanization of Africa, the false borders that have been created, the forced armed dispersal of African people throughout the world, including our presence here in the United States and other places where people are viewing and participating in this study. So there are people who find ourselves responding to how that looks at any given moment. And one way that looks at this time is this battle that surrounds the presidency of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has become evil personified for many of us. However, as I've just attempted to suggest, the problem that we have is much bigger than Trump. And it is historic. Trump did not get us to Jamaica, Haiti, all those other places. Trump did not divide Africa into these untenable entities that people refer to as countries and often even as nations. Trump is not the ones who've been patrolling our communities, these armed forces, killing our children, and doing all the other kinds of humiliating things to us. And I want to say simply that it's bigger than Trump. That's fundamentally what I'm talking about. It's systemic. There's something about the system that we have to deal with. And that's important because some people do not understand how we as the party will set off on a strategical approach to every question. That is, every question that we deal with, we have already defined the basis for dealing with them, even though we don't know. We can't anticipate every specific thing that's going to happen. We've defined this entity that we're dealing with. We said, this is how it works. This is what makes it work. Therefore, when you see certain kind of phenomena, you need to be able to understand that phenomena in relationship to the overall contradiction we're confronted with. Otherwise, you will be confused, and you can do, as many people are doing now, thinking that some kind of victory is on the horizon simply because Trump appears to be in trouble, and there's this thought of impeaching Trump. There are many people, I've seen this even a year ago or more, people were talking about from our community, some people who are noted militants in our community with actual legitimate credentials as activists and in our community fighting for democracy, who've been calling for Trump's impeachment. And so it looks like it's happening. And so for many people, that's the battle, that's the thing that shows some kind of victory for us. And thus being able to see things in the short terms. And of course, Trump is the problem. So get rid of Trump, 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 Trump. That's what we're hearing. Trump is a fascist. Trump is a proto-fascist. Trump is all these problems, as if Trump is the basis for the contradiction we're looking at. And some people make that mistake, and some people cannot understand why we're not jumping on every issue when it happens like this, because they can't see the strategic approach that we take to every question based on how we understand the overall issue. The political report to our Congress is the instrument that we use to actually shape our understanding, define our understanding. Here's the trajectory we see things happening in the world, how the system works, how it's working at this time, and how we have to move in it. And it's a comprehensive approach. And I want to say that because there have been people who from time to time have been disappointed because we don't act like this around a particular question when they don't connect this particular issue to the overall contradiction, how things are unfolding to kill the monster. And that's what it is that we are about. So we want to look at Vanguard, and we want to go to that section, the Crisis of Imperialism. As we mentioned, there's much ado about impeaching Trump. And there's much ado about the attempts made by Trump to twist the arm, force, put in a chokehold the president of Ukraine to force the Ukrainian government to function as an arm of his campaign to win this election by turning the Ukrainian government into an instrument to discredit his equally criminal opponent, in this instance Biden, and his equally criminal son. And the son is probably more criminal because he's younger, more energetic, and is not as likely to get off point in terms of losing his concentration when exploiting and engaging in his criminality. So the Trump, and yes, Trump did it. I say this right away because presidents, U.S. governments do this stuff. This is not a Trump thing. They overthrow governments that don't do what they want them to do. Why the hell would they not go and say, this is what we want you to do in terms of my opponent? Reagan did that. He made an arrangement with the Iranians that you will not expose, you will not free the hostages. This was in the 1970s until the election is over, because he was using the hostage, as they call it, crisis, these spies that were in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran when the Iranians took it over and did the overthrew through the puppet regime of the Shah of Iran, and they captured this nest of spies, as they characterized it, which was the embassy in Tehran, the capital of Iran. Reagan, who was running for president against James Earl Carter, had emissaries to convince the Iranians to not free the hostages until the election was over, so that he could use the existence of the hostages as a campaign instrument to show the ineptitude of the Carter regime and how he was functioning to help the Americans lose face and lose their greatness and what have you. And Reagan, as you remember, ran on a campaign to make America great again. He just called it something else. He would, make it white nationalist. He was the guy on the white horse at that time. So it's not new. Reagan did do that. The U.S. did do that. The United States government found itself involved in making deals, trading drugs for money for drugs and military forces to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. And there was no talk of impeaching Reagan for trying to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. There's no talk of impeaching Trump for the crimes that he has committed against the peoples of the world. There's no debate about, from Democrat or Republican, about impeaching Trump for starving the people in Venezuela, for leading this attack on the people of Yemen that's caused more than 100,000 people to be pushed out of their country, scores of thousands of people being murdered by U.S. weapons. There's no talk of getting rid of this guy. There's no talk of impeaching, was no talk of impeaching any of the criminals who, working with the Saudis, participated in the 9/11. And everybody who was involved in 9/11 was from Saudi Arabia. And there's no discussion of impeaching anybody. It has nothing to do with the people. No discussion about why the United States government hasn't done anything about driving more and more Africans into severe states of poverty and despair, not only in this country and around the world. None whatsoever. No discussion of whether Johnson should have been impeached for overthrowing Nkrumah, whether Kennedy or Eisenhower names should be besmirched or because of their assassination of Patrice Lumumba. Ain't got nothing to do with that. This is a contest between sectors of the white ruling class. It has nothing to do with the masses of the people. The masses of the people become simple pawns to facilitate the agenda of one or another sector of the ruling class in this country. So that's part of what needs to be understood. And I'm saying this again because we have this tendency when people do not have the advantage of a genuine analysis that's informed by a scientific theory, then they will see what's happening at the moment as the critical thing and jump on that, and sometimes working against our own interests, okay? And we don't play like that if we can help it. And so I want to go now, we're looking at the deepening crisis of imperialism, and this was from the political report to the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. And so that 7th Congress happened in 2013, was it? Was it 13, 15? 18, 2018. So that's right, 2018. That's right, because we were, yeah, just a year ago. So the deepening crisis of imperialism, and we begin on page 117. And this is chapter 4, the tipping point of the uneasy equilibrium. The unending wars waged by the United States from one end of the earth to the other are evidence of the crisis of imperialism. Perhaps the greatest example of imperialist crisis today, however, can be found in the White House, the seat of U.S. governmental power. Every day there is a new scandal associated with the regime of U.S. President Donald Trump. A host of explanations is being advanced by the thinking representatives of the white ruling class for why the Trump administration continues to be embroiled in crippling controversy. The struggle being waged against his regime by other sectors of the white ruling class is extraordinary. And people know that. I mean, I've never seen anything like this. I mean, for every day that Trump has been in office, there have been hit pieces coming out from bourgeois media. Every day, not a single day has passed since he was elected that this has not been happening. The Trump regime, and it's important to point that out. I mean, you say, well, Trump has a rotten this and a rotten that, but everyone has. I mean, George Bush stole an election, and everybody knew he stole an election, including Al Gore, who was the person who was contending for the same office, but you did not see on a daily basis this kind of thing happening. Of course, one of the things for Bush was 9/11 that helped to raise his stature high, out of this atmosphere. So the Trump administration, the Trump regime is not fundamentally different from the Obama regime that preceded it. It is certainly not a departure from the predatory colonial capitalist campaign of Hillary Clinton, his 2016 Democratic Party opponent, whose loss to Trump sent shockwaves through the white ruling class elite. We have said all along that the electoral process is simply a vehicle for nonviolent struggle by contending sectors of the colonial capitalist ruling class for control of the state for their own profit-making advantage. That's all it is. There is nothing biblical about the electoral process. It is simply a vehicle for non-violent struggle by contending sectors of the colonial capitalist ruling class for control of the state for their own profit-making advantage. Nothing clarifies this fact more than the 2016 U.S. presidential campaign and Trump's election. The state is the organ, we're saying it's a struggle for capture, a nonviolent struggle for the capture of the state. The state is the organ of coercion utilized by the ruling class to protect the system of colonial capitalism. It is clearly the police, courts, jails, and other repressive institutions. It is also the military and the various intelligence components associated with it. The state is the FBI, CIA, NSA, and the assorted secret police agents about which most people know nothing, including the NGA, National Global Spatial Entity, and people don't know anything about these institutions in many instances. The state has existed since European society split into irreconcilable classes, into groups locked into a relationship of the exploited and the exploiters, where the exploiters live at the expense of the others. The state is older than the U.S. In ancient Rome and Greece, the state protected the interests of the slave owners over the slaves. In feudal Europe, it upheld the interests of the nobility over the peasants and serfs. The state's always been there. We talk about feudal Europe, we talk about the mythological Robin Hood who hung out in Sherwood Forest and was being chased by the sheriff of Nottingham. Is that where the sheriff was located? That was the state. The sheriff was the state. And the state was extracting all kinds of value, resources, tax and what have you, forcing people to fight the wars of the nobility, etc. The state did that. That's what the state looked like in feudal Europe. The European imperialist invasion of Africa, Asia, and the lands now known as the Americas created a new capitalist social system. Now the state was no longer simply an instrument of coercion directed at protecting and maintaining the power of a social system within the boundaries of specific European territories. So this is an idea that we are forwarding that should be understood, that the state has always been there. It was always in Europe since the split of the society into these irreconcilable interests. The rule and the rule, the exploiters and the exploited. The state has been there. It's to protect that relationship. When I say that relationship, I mean the ongoing existence of the oppressed and the oppressor, the exploited and the exploiters. How do you protect that relationship? By making sure that the oppressed never overturns the system, kills the oppressor, that the exploited never overturns the system, kills and removes the exploiters. The state protects that relationship all the time. It doesn't mean that it protects every person who represents that relationship or that government. It protects that relationship. And that's something that should really be understood, because at different times, different persons who have been the former representatives of the society, of the state, of the government have themselves been eliminated by the state. Look at the Kennedys. Look at how the state got rid of Nixon. Look how the state has moved at different times to get rid of entities who challenge the stability and continued existence of the system itself, of that relationship between the oppressed and the oppressors. So up until the advent of capitalism, and we recognize that capitalism, unlike what most of the Marxists and white militants and so-called socialists and communists have taught in the past, and their minions, the capitalism was born of slavery and colonialism. It was born from empire, from the imperialism. And even the term imperialism as we know it is something that only came into existence in the 18th century. That's when imperialism as a concept was born. I mean, a Roman imperium had been talked about in ancient Rome and what have you, but imperialism is something that European communists, militants, and socialists invented this concept to explain something that was happening in the world. This is from the viewpoint of the capitalist system that had come into existence, this concept of imperialism. And so they wanted to say that capitalism came first out of Europe, in Europe, and then from this, as capitalism, as Lenin defined it, became rotten right. It is something in terms of its development, imperialism was born. We say, no, 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 no. And this is just simply another sophisticated way of putting the white man first and putting the European society first. It didn't happen that way. It was like, it's only an afterthought that later on Marx talks about how capitalism came into existence as a consequence of what he referred to as primitive accumulation. This, he said, was the equivalent in political economy. It was the equivalence of original sin in theology. This is the starting point. He said, turning Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins. And he talked also about other things like the war that the British made against China to initiate the opium trade and turn China itself into a nation of junkies. So that was an afterthought. He couldn't get to an explanation of capitalism coming into existence without mentioning that. And that was something that he said, not to explain the conditions of the enslaved, not to explain the conditions of those colonized, not to explain the conditions of those who have been violated, but to explain Europe, to explain the development of Europe. I don't know if I'm clear on that or not. So the starting point for him is not what has been ravished in Africa, South America, even in China. The starting point for him is what has happened in Europe and how this factored into the development of Europe. We were simply accessories, if you will, auxiliaries to the development of Europe itself, okay? Anyway, I didn't intend to go off on that. But it's important because what we've done with this discussion is we've changed and challenged most of what has been understood in terms of the advent of capitalism, the change of the world that brings us here where we are now. And this takes us back to the whole question of how we approach everything, because if your starting point is where Europeans opened the book, then the problem is the one that white people have with the advent of capitalism. You understand? Well, we're saying the problem originated before that. The problem is what happened to Africa, what happened to what we now call the Americas, what happened to places like New Zealand and Australia, and what happened to African people on the continent of Africa itself. That's where the problem began. The problem began in the places where the United States is making war, even today, throughout the Middle East and things like that. These are the places where the problem began, not in Europe. And if you don't understand that, then you got your fighting equipment, and you're running around trying to put out the fire in Europe. But Ho Chi Minh was correct when he told the people in the Third International, Communist International, he said, if you're looking for imperialism, he said, it's the tail that's in Europe, but the head of imperialism is in the colonies. He was absolutely correct when he said that. Anyway, so what happened was with the advent of capitalism, which came as a consequence of slavery and colonialism and Europe's aggression to people around the world that created Europe itself, what happened was the state now is different than it was when it was in Europe alone. Now the state is born as this, what we might characterize today as international entity.
It was born like that because it had to be able to protect the status quo, the system that was now coming into existence as a consequence of Europe going out into the world, stealing resources. This is how capitalism is being born. It was not born as something internal to Europe. It was born because Europe went out into the rest of the world and created a whole different a kind of social system that that includes Europe, but includes the rest of the world. So now the state is something different. I don't know if I'm clear. It's different. It's not the sheriff of Nottingham, or it's the sheriff of Nottingham armed with atomic weapons. It's what we're looking at to control everybody in the world. So the capitalist state created structures that protected and projected the interests of the bourgeoisie in faraway places. This was the bourgeoisie made possible by the primary features of what Karl Marx termed the primitive accumulation of capital, the genesis of the capitalist system itself. The capitalist state was a consequence of Europe's imperialist assault on Africa and the rest of the peoples of the world. It has always had a global capacity flowing from its parasitic and predatory origin. Contrary to the notion that globalization is a new historical phenomenon, capitalism was born as a world system. The capitalist state is an international state power. Without bourgeois elections, the ruling class would be reduced to fielding their own private armies to advance their interests. They would be nothing more than the warlords that we see in some countries that have not achieved or developed the slavery-funded sophistication of bourgeois democracy most often found in European countries. So the elections, the bourgeois elections, makes it unnecessary then for Trump to have simply his own army, for Biden to have his own army. I say Trump and Biden, but what I really mean are those sectors of the ruling class that Trump and Biden represent. They would have to have their, this is how it worked in the past. Even during feudalism, you found nobility, lords and what have you, hiring out forces, even among their own countries, who would go out and fight the wars for them. That happened even with the so-called Crusades. They hired these forces out, left their families and stuff like that because they couldn't feed them otherwise, many of them, to fight for the nobility. So the bourgeois electoral process was designed to protect the colonial capitalist system from destruction by internecine war between predators competing for resources and markets. Otherwise, if you didn't have this, then these forces fighting and competing in the bourgeoisie among the capitalists themselves will be constantly fighting among themselves. They would have their own wars. They would have their own armies. They're competing for similar resources, or they're competing for domination of the economy. What sort of resource will dominate? Whether it's going to be the forces who are tied to what's that place in California where they make all the computer stuff and et cetera? So what valley is that? Silicon Valley, or forces tied to the oil in Texas and all this stuff, which all of them intend to continue, and the capitalist system protects all of them, but each of them is seeking its own advantages in this relationship. And then there are contending forces who are dealing with the energy interests, who themselves are contending among each other. And then there are contending forces even in this high-tech thing, because you might know that Elizabeth Warren, for example, has just talked about breaking up the major high-tech entities like Google and Facebook and all of this stuff. And some sectors of the bourgeoisie actually celebrate that. They want that to happen, partially because they can't compete as long as these forces are monopolizing everything. You see, so the capitalists themselves are constantly having to struggle to see which interest is going to prevail. And the things that makes it unnecessary for them to come and hire out people inside the country to fight these wars for them in public is the electoral process. And they have these persons who are shills, nothing but shills for sector of the bourgeoisie, when you see these people lined up in a so-called debate that doesn't say anything that has to do with the people here around the world, they are representing the bourgeoisie. When you look at what is happening now and talking about impeachment, it's got nothing to do with the mass of people. This is the bourgeoisie, as we will show, that's in a contest with itself. So, the 2016, so we say again, the bourgeois electoral process was designed to protect the colonial capitalist system from destruction by internecine war between capitalist predators competing for resources and markets. This is a war between capitalist predators. This is no damn good guys. This is no Obama, the good guy, colored guy fighting against the white bad guys who are not colored. You understand? This is a war between contending sectors of the bourgeoisie who will use anybody to fight for them and send your children to war, to places in Syria and all to fight for them because they will not fight for themselves. They got to be able to mobilize masses of people to do that. So they hide their own hand, and they use the electoral process to get people to vote for one sector or the other, and your interest is never even on the agenda until Akilé ran for office in St. Petersburg, Florida, and said reparations, 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 make the South Side black again. You don't find that on the agenda electorally normally. So in this way, the electoral process functions as a component of colonial capitalist state power. The electoral process itself functions as a component of colonial capitalist state power. The 2016 U.S. presidential election was also a white ruling class contest for control of the colonial capitalist state. It was a contest that was clothed in bourgeois idealism designed to obscure the intentions and interests of the minority white ruling class in order to win mass support from white people. The ability, and we say to obscure, sometimes it's not just to obscure, because sometimes the white people know what the real deal is, and they speak in codes and stuff like that everybody can see what they mean when they're fighting against crime and, you know, put the criminals in jail and to make our cities safe again. Everybody knows this is buzzwords. They're talking about fighting against African people. But what the electoral process does is allow for these politicians to establish the political line that even the most dreadful white nationalists can use to explain their aggression against Africans and other colonized people around the world, right? So Trump talks about criminals and rapists coming across the border when everybody should know, everybody does know. If it doesn't take only a little bit to scratch the lie off, the cover off this lie, is that the criminals and rapists and what have you, the ones who took the land from the people who they now separate from their own resources by creating a border after they stole it, right? The ability of the white masses to vote for their ruling class masters shrouds the dictatorship of the white rulers. This ability to vote has come to define democracy in the U.S. and for much of the white capitalist-dominated world. The 2016 U.S. presidential election was a clear indicator of the growth of the crisis of imperialism. The fact that there were 17 Republicans contending for the nomination of their party and 6 major contenders for the Democratic Party nomination of a total of 23 altogether reveal a fractured white ruling class incapable of choosing a popular representative of its splintered economic interests. And that was 17 then. The Democratic Party primary electoral season started off with 24. And that's just deepening crisis of the whole imperialist social system. The bourgeoisie itself is fractured. And it's now picking all these different persons to go out and try to represent their interests to get the best advantage. And of course, the electoral process itself serves to obscure the fact that you got the bourgeoisie that's fighting for its own interests. It comes before the people and asks the slave to vote for the best slave master, asks the oppressor to vote for the best oppressor, And the only thing on the agenda in this election is the oppressor's interest and the slave master's interest, and the masses of people do not have the interest at all. Even if you got a Bernie Sanders who promises that he is a socialist and he is fighting for $15 an hour over a number of years, is protecting capitalism. How in the hell should the workers who produce all the value in the world be satisfied with $15 a year, an hour? What he's done is place a cap on what the working class should be fighting for, removing the working class as the primary entity that should be fighting to take the whole thing, because the workers produce all the value on stolen land of indigenous people, right? And stolen resources coming from Africa and much of the colonized world. So that ain't doing nothing to help the working class. It's doing something to help the bourgeoisie. He wants to fight for a benevolent capitalism, or a more benevolent capitalism. So the campaign occurred, that is 2016, in a world that is being defined by the struggle of oppressed peoples, whose subjugation is a condition for the success of the overall parasitic capitalist project. While U.S. politicians put their political programs forward as determinants of world history, all the presidential contenders were being driven by imperialist crisis that continues to threaten the stability and existence of colonial capitalism. So they put their forth there, they're going to save the world, and this is why they're doing it. They're really nice people. Just happen to have billions of dollars at their command. But we're saying that there were other factors that was driving what it was they were doing. So in the political report to our 2016 plenary, we spoke of this crisis through the voice of one of the leading imperialist thinkers of the time. Zbigniew Brzezinski had recognized the crisis of imperialism for years. Brzezinski has been writing about this thing. In his 2007 book, Second Chance, Three Presidents and the Crisis of American Superpower, Brzezinski proved prescient in his explanation of the ruling class split into a myriad of self-serving components of fighting for shares in an imperialist pie shrunken by the world's peoples desperately struggling to take back their lives and resources from a blood-drenched imperialism. Says Brzezinski, quote, "Global political awakening is historically anti-imperial, politically anti-Western, and emotionally increasingly anti-American. In the process, it is setting in motion a major shift, that is to say, the global political awakening is setting in motion a major shift in the global center of gravity. That, in turn, is altering the global distribution of power, with major implications for America's role in the world." Now, Brzezinski wrote this in 2007, right? The foremost, and Brzezinski was a far-seeing representative of the bourgeoisie. And African internationalism represents the far-seeing representation of the African working class and oppressed peoples around the world. It is a theory that informs our approach to every analysis that we make. And the political report that I'm reading from is the one that we take to our Congress to help the African People's Socialist Party, the advanced detachment of the African working class, and the African Revolution. It keeps us aware of what it is we are contending with and what it is our task based on a scientific analysis. And we even use information and analysis from the bourgeoisie to make the point that we're making. The foremost geopolitical effect of global political awakening is the demise of the imperial age. Empires have existed throughout history, and in recent times, American paramountcy has often been described as a new global empire, unquote. This is Brzezinski. So all this stuff that they're talking about, why they're doing what they're doing, Brzezinski is saying that there's a crisis afoot here, that there's been a shift of power. and that the day of empire is over, more or less, right? And he would say more than that. He would say how the imperialists can maintain some semblance of leadership by leading from behind, more or less, and mixing it up with each other and stop fighting so much among the imperialists. He wants to stop to moderate the contest between the imperialists and come up with another method of leadership that does not allow the white man to be always in front of everything. Because he says something is the age of empire is over. America can't lead in the same old way. The contenders for the presidency during the 2016 elections were confronted by the reality described here by Brzezinski. They represented different sectors of the white ruling class. As Trump declared at every opportunity, they were hirelings of big money. Their individual political programs advanced during the campaign represented the different positions of their big-moneyed employers who needed control of the U.S. state to realize their aim. But despite the fact that individual blocks of capital always fight to advance their own interests and were doing so in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, they have usually struggled within a generally agreed upon framework. Since the mid-1940s, when the U.S. and much of Europe coalesced around a general strategy to counter the growing influence of the Soviet Union, the U.S. took the lead in creating what became known as the Atlantic Bloc, whose proponents are known as Atlanticists. Since the 1940s, and it tried to do this in the early part of the 20th century, at the time coming out of the first imperialist world war with the League of Nations. This was a U.S. project initiated by Woodrow Wilson, who was the then president. But he was not able to bring the U.S. Congress onto this, and so the U.S. didn't participate in the League of Nations directly. And so it took another war, the one that happened that people, talk about. In fact, the first imperialist war was supposed to be the war that ended the wars. Wasn't that supposed to be the war that ended the wars? Something to that effect. And one of the reasons that it ended the war was because they came up with a new system where white power would make peace happen because it was understood that the disruption to the peace was a contest between different sectors internationally of the ruling class for control of the rest of us. So they created this thing called the League of Nations, where they would have an ability to vote among themselves and even allow the enslaved, the colonized to some extent, minimally at this time, they created a system and made sure that the colonized, even if you became the majority in this thing, would not be able to make anything happen. This was something that was designed to protect the system of imperialism and white colonial domination of the world, and it was, just as the United Nations calls itself now, the League of Nations was an institution that was designed to make peace, and peace among the contenders, among the imperialist forces, so you don't have to have this war. You can sit around a table in public view, and you can have these discussions about who was going to do what. You can send out armies to collectively to protect your interests, to keep the oppressed, and that kind of thing. So that's what happened with the League of Nations in 1919. And then coming out of the Second Imperialist War, we have created the United Nations, that the United States now is full-fledged. And by the way, the League of Nations, what's that place where much of the international activity happens around the United Nations? I went there. Where is that? In Holland, The Hague. That was the headquarters of the initial League of Nations. It's still there as an instrument of the United Nations. So we say that since the mid-1940s, when the U.S. and much of Europe coalesced around a general strategy to counter the growing influence of the Soviet Union, the U.S. took the lead in creating what became known as the Atlanticist Bloc. And the Soviet Union was commonly referred to in the United States as Soviet what? Russia. It was commonly referred to as Soviet Russia, or sometimes just as Russia. I was in jail. It was really interesting. I was in jail in Clearwater, Florida, Pinellas County, and I had several books with me. One was a book written by a man named Dostoevsky. I don't remember which one it was, but it was a Russian name. And because it was a Russian name, the guards didn't want me to have it. Do you understand? The guards didn't want me to have it because Russia equated to communism and the Soviet Union. Of course, Dostoevsky was the furthest thing you could be from a Russian communist or socialist, but it was Russia. And the point I'm making here is that that was what Russia was, the Soviet Union was perceived as Russia, Russia as the Soviet Union, and they talk about it today as if it were the same thing. So we say that since the mid-1940s, the U.S. was much, Europe coalesced around a general strategy to counter the growing influence of the Soviet Union. The U.S. took the lead in creating what became known as the Atlanticist bloc, whose proponents are known as the Atlanticists. And the concern about the Soviet Union was that the Soviet Union was playing this role in two ways. One, it created the notion that the workers should dominate the world as opposed to the bourgeoisie. This was the philosophical assumption. And they also, contended that there should be this world social system, that communism would be a world system, not just some local entity. That's why you hear now most of the right-wingers who are anti-globalists and against the world system and stuff like that, they preach that the U.S. is going to lose its identity, its authority, it becomes a part of this greater thing, it's a part of the United Nations, etc. That's why they hate the United Nations in many instances, even though the United Nations has served them quite well up to now, because it presupposes the existence of this global system that the Soviets, the communists, promoted. And so the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was the most obvious political and military manifestation of the Atlanticist bloc. It also involved economic and security components that bound the liberal anti-communist white rulers into a common strategic trajectory for world domination. That included what we now know as the Marshall Plan. That the U.S. likes to brag about how we rescued Europe, etc. No, what you did was do everything you can to prevent the rise of the workers in Europe and communism and the rest of that by pumping resources into Europe and also turning into a near vassal. Most of Western Europe became vassals and servants of U.S. imperialism for the longest period of time through the Marshall Plan, which loans and other kinds of economic relations meant that the United States would dominate that area of the world for a long period of time, and even had military troops and forces throughout Europe, ostensibly to protect Europe from communism, but certainly to make sure that Europe stayed in line and maintained itself as a part of the now incredibly powerful United States that had become the center of the world economy. U.S. leadership through the Atlanticist bloc included the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, and an assortment of other related institutions, including international trade and economic bodies. Also, a part of this bloc was an international court system that obeyed U.S. edicts, although the U.S. refused to recognize this authority as applicable to itself. An example of rule without regard for law, otherwise known as dictatorship. The United Nations inherited the role previously assumed by the League of Nations, another U.S. brainchild that failed to win support within U.S. ruling circles after being advanced by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson following the First Imperialist World War. This role was as unifier and peacekeeper among predatory imperialist white powers that have historically gone to war over divisions of the colonial capitalist spoils among themselves. Like the League of Nations, the United Nations was to function as a supranational agency that assured peaceful, nonviolent European control of the world's oppressed colonized peoples. The entire Atlanticist arrangement was designed to advance the interests of capitalism and the capitalist system by containing Soviet Russia. Another goal was to smother Germany's historical proclivity for violent domination of Europe that had resulted in two previous imperialist wars to divide the world. And I'm not sure that's absolutely accurate. I mean, there's this whole thing about Germany's, proclivity. Germany is the one that always just, but that ain't actually true. I mean, this whole war thing that was going on within Europe and because, Germany fought against the arrangement that had been established with the Versailles Treaty, that defeated Germany had to lay prostrate at the feet of Europe, and Europe took all of its colonial possessions and much of its own territory, etc., as form of reparations and what have you from Germany. But Germany lost that war. And not only lost that war, but it has become defined by European history as this extraordinary predator. That is to say that it was not like the other capitalist predators, Germany. And because, Germany, to take back what had been stolen from it after the First Imperialist War, a whole serious kind of nationalism deepened in Germany. And you saw Deutschland über alles, Germany over every damn thing became the slogan. But Germany lost that war. And so the victors have defined Germany. But the reality is that these struggles and wars within Europe has been going. I mean, how can France not be described in a similar way? I mean, with Napoleon and all of these other things, but Germany became defined as that. But so part of what they wanted to do was to control Germany because they had just fought Germany. And so we say that for some time now, the Atlanticist arrangement has been fraying. The decline of the Atlantic bloc was hastened by the 1991 collapse of Soviet Russia, whose existence was the impetus for its founding and the invention of the imperialist Cold War. So now, how do you justify maintaining the Atlantic bloc when the basis, the rationale for its creation, doesn't exist anymore in the form of the Soviet Union? U.S. collaboration with Europe on most questions now became increasingly unnecessary. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, U.S. collaboration with Europe on most questions now became increasingly unnecessary since the U.S. no longer had to compete for European loyalty with a now severely crippled post-Soviet Russia. So they don't even have to pretend so much to get along with Europe because now the Soviet Union, which is the contending force that the United States had to compete with for the loyalty of Europe and much of the world, doesn't exist anymore. So the U.S. acts, as it wants to act without any likelihood from their perspective of any contention. Even in the Middle East, Africa, all these places there used to be this assumption that the Soviet Union was a factor that can impact on how they act. That doesn't exist anymore. U.S. does what the hell it wants to do because it's now the last imperialist thug standing. It's got the greatest army, the greatest military. It pumps trillions of dollars into that thing. It's got at least 800 and some odd military bases stretched across the globe. It doesn't have to get along with anybody. That's the stance that it has taken with the collapse of the Soviet Union. With the Soviet Union gone, Russia was no longer an ideal political and economic contender in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and other regions of the world. What had been considered a bipolar world has suddenly become a unipolar world with U.S. imperialism unquestionably at the helm. But all this changed. Lenin's declaration that the capitalists would sell someone the rope to hang him with, as he was saying, the capitalists are pretty venal. Profit is such a motivating thing that if you want to have a lynching party and the capitalist was to be the victim, he said, you got enough rope, right? I got to sail on rope, So Lenin's declaration that the capitalists would sell someone the rope to hang him with was realized by the mad rush by all the European capitalists to take advantage of a presumed hapless China. The capitalists invaded with the intention of capturing the more than 1 billion Chinese as a lucrative market. And China was the sleeping dragon. You understand? So they're going to rush into China, and they're going to take everything out of China. And of course, and their greed blinded them to the potential, even the possibility that China might be for China. You understand? And somehow was just lay on his belly and say, come on in. Like China has a short memory. That China doesn't remember the humiliations and et cetera that's been experienced. That China doesn't remember how it used to be, you don't stand a Chinaman's chance, et cetera. This is the way they went in. So to the dismay of the Europeans and U.S. capitalists, China instead became a major economic and political power whose success has come at the expense of the absolute hegemony of the U.S. and European capitalism in general. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant that Soviet opportunism could no longer exert influence over the struggles of the oppressed. Many groups that were stronger in the Middle East and other places because of Soviet support for struggles against U.S. and imperialist white power lost their influence to indigenous movements. And this is what we were saying at the time. People were running around celebrating the victory of U.S. imperialism because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. We knew that was going to open up 1,000 new fronts against the imperialists because the Soviet had many ways had functioned as an impediment to the development of the people's struggles, because the Soviets had funded, given training and other kinds of resources to peoples in the Middle East and Africa and other places, but it was to carry out the interests of the Soviet Union, the Soviet state. And so sometimes the Soviet Union went through these different changes and categories of peaceful coexistence with the imperialists, for example. That Khrushchev was the one, after Stalin, promoted peaceful coexistence. And so that meant that you wouldn't, and before that, you know, when Stalin was alive, you had the United Front against fascism. So that the colonized people couldn't fight in their own interest. They had to fight based on, and with the resources that the Soviet Union would give them, their policies were determined by the interests of the Soviet state who was funding them and giving these resources. Now that the Soviet state is no longer a factor, it unleashed all kinds of hell. And of course, this was something that the U.S. contributed to with its own strategy of trying to destroy at some juncture the Soviet Union by giving resources to what they consider jihadists, a resurrecting jihadist movement throughout Asia, throughout the Middle East, and of course has unleashed all these forces that the Soviet Union had been able to contain. If the Soviet power had still been in existence, 9/11 would never have happened if the jihadists had anything to do with it. All the stuff that you see happening, if the Soviet had been there, it wouldn't have happened. What you see because they did not serve Soviet interests to initiate that struggle. Because among other things, it would have put the Soviet Union in almost a direct confrontation with the United States. Both of these armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, and they've done everything to avoid a direct confrontation with each other. So the proxies have been the ones who've been making all these struggles for them. But if the Soviet Union had sent somebody into the United States to bomb that, and the Soviet Union had done what many have claimed unreasonably, and to have killed Kennedy when it was the U.S. state itself that killed Kennedy, then this would have been almost a declaration of war between these powers. They don't mind war, but they don't want war that could destroy them. They want us to fight their wars for them. And that's what's happened, generally speaking. So anyway, this has unleashed massive anti-colonial resistance by Islamic-led movements fueled by poverty and repression by domestic U.S. and European puppet regimes. A history of European insults and humiliation and deeply held memories of the European Christian crusades that provided a religious-based explanation for their struggle. There is no little irony in the fact that the modern jihadist movement was organized, funded, and trained by the U.S. under the regime of U.S. President James Earl Carter. This is the last good president, they say. It was Carter's national security advisor, Brzezinski and Carter just, 95 now, and just failed and broke something, and now, but he's a good guy. He's going out to do Habitat for Humanity. So you got this system that takes all the housing and homes for the people, and he runs around building 2 or 3 houses, and somehow he is the savior. He's a Christian. Plus he teaches Sunday school every Sunday, even when he's broken his ribs and is generally falling apart. He shows up for Sunday school. He's a good guy. And if you don't understand imperialism, you'll think he's a good guy. And, it was Carter's national security advisor, Brzezinski, who saw this as an anti-Soviet strategy to drain Soviet Russia economically by creating Russia's own Vietnam in Afghanistan, where there was a progressive Soviet-supported government in place. It was the folly of Carter and Brzezinski to think that in the minds of the jihadists, the U.S. white nationalist state would not also be seen as the imperialist infidel that had brought the Islamic world to its knees. It would not be long after the defeat of the Afghanistan government before the jihadists would also turn their guns on the U.S., other imperialist powers, and imperial craven domestic minions. This is what the CIA calls blowback. In other words, what goes around comes around. This method continues to be used repeatedly by the CIA. Colonialism, direct and indirect, which is the economic base of the global colonial capitalist system, was in a state of flux, along with the reliant political and economic arrangements tethered to it. The cozy relationship U.S. President Trump appears to want with Russia, the open near declaration of war with the G7 group that presumes to collectively control the world's economy, the rocky courtship of China that involves the move toward rapprochement with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and the ongoing internecine wars within ruling circles that stretch around the globe are evidence of a major shift in the political and economic alignments that have defined much of the world for the last 70 plus years of imperialist world domination. The near absolute 500-year-old control of the world by the white man is on a shaky foundation that our party has described as an uneasy equilibrium. The dominant world colonial capitalist social system responsible for white wealth and security and the brutal oppressive impoverishment of the rest of us sits on the foundation of a profound earth-shaking war between the colonial past and a post-colonial, increasingly visible, liberated future. We of the African People's Socialist Party are contenders on the world stage. We are conscious, organized participants in the struggle of the oppressed and colonized. Our resistance is responsible for starving the bloated white nationalist colonial capitalist system to the point of desperate divisions. This has resulted in every white man for himself. Today we see a scramble for new economic and political relations to stave off collapse of respective parasitic European economies within the shrinking system. Indeed, this is a crisis of imperialism. It is also a moment where the possibilities of a new imperialist world war are greater than ever. Extremely significant economic interests are at stake. Bloodthirsty imperialist predators are willing and capable of mobilizing the oppressed of the world to fight other oppressed peoples to their collective extinction in the interest of protecting imperialism. Trump's move to normalize relations with Russia, China, and Korea are being met with efforts to derail negotiations by an assortment of political forces, even within the Trump administration. The U.S. North American imperialist state, connected internationally with state institutions of imperialist powers of other countries, is generally committed to an Atlanticist strategy, with a huge political and military economy revolving around it. There are Atlanticists within the Democratic and Republican parties, also within the Trump regime, whence several attempts to block Trump's move with Russia, China, and Korea have originated. The efforts by Trump's Vice President Michael Richard Pence and U.S. National Security Advisor John Robert Bolton to scuttle the U.S. Democratic People's Republic of Korea summit are examples. And you know, Pence and Bolton were key out front people who wanted to make sure that the U.S. and North Korea did not come to some kind of rapprochement. To the point that Bolton, I think, even used language that we're going to treat North Korea just like we did Libya, which everybody knows resulted in Libya disarming itself and Gaddafi, who was the head of the state, being murdered in the streets of Libya. The Atlanticists do not represent some kind of mysterious secret society. They are openly written and spoken of often in authoritative bourgeois media outlets, including political opposites like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. They represent a very important economic agenda that was organized around the post-Second Imperialist War trajectory to protect and advance capitalist interests redefined by the outcome of the war. Almost all the economic and political relations in the world were organized around, influenced, or driven by the intra-capitalist hegemonic authority of the Atlanticists. The Atlanticists have historically defined the security interests of imperialism. The influence of the Atlanticists reached down into the retirement funds and job security of the hired killers that make up the officers and ranks of the U.S. military, the FBI, CIA, NSA, local cops, and other terrorist organizations of the imperialist gendarme. The Trump candidacy sounded so outlandish to many because his articulations challenged the long-held Atlanticist assumptions fed to the general public and regurgitated by every legitimate political hack on both sides of the ocean. What soon became clear after the 2016 U.S. presidential election is that the intra-capitalist struggle for control of the state was not resolved. Remember, we said that the bourgeois elections are simply non-violent contests between different sectors of the bourgeoisie for control of the state to their own economic advantage. And so what soon became clear after the 2016 U.S. presidential election is that the intra-capitalist struggle, that is the struggle between the capitalists themselves for control of the state, was not resolved. They didn't resolve it in this election. Trump, an outlier who contended in the electoral process without economic and political support from and general unity with the Atlanticists, had become at least nominal custodian of the U.S. colonial capitalist state. So now Trump has ascended to the presidency. Nobody thought this was going to happen. And so now the question of who controls the state was not something that was decided by the different sectors of the bourgeoisie who had their candidates who were running for president. Trump becomes the president. So who controls the state? And so now, and Trump, of course, we predicted this, that Trump now has what appears to be this outlandish kind of policies and politics that challenges everything that's been put forward, including NATO and the whole Atlanticist arrangement, the United Nations. Remember, Trump was criticizing all the stuff. Trump was criticizing the wars that were happening every place, and now he's come to power. But we also knew that Trump didn't have a party, didn't have the kind of organization, so he's going to have to rely on other sectors of the bourgeoisie to put into his campaign, his office, and his administration. And who does he pull into his administration? Atlanticists. These are the only ones with the skills, with the connections, and with connections to the state that's there to protect the system, protect the relationship between the oppressor and oppressor. He has to call on them, which is why every time you look up, he was firing somebody. This person, and if he didn't fire them, another sector of the bourgeoisie would expose them for something that they have done that made them somebody who was unreliable, that they couldn't handle. The general who was the thief. You remember the general who was there? No, he was the thief. The general who was there, I think his national security advisor, some other role, didn't last a month or two before he was kicked out. And this is contention between the bourgeoisie, because this is somebody the bourgeoisie didn't trust and didn't feel like they could handle. And Pence is there because this ongoing war against Trump, and they want to make sure somebody's there to work out for their interests, and if Trump goes down, they got their president, who is an Atlanticist. What soon became clear, this is crisis on steroids. Not because Trump was an anti-capitalist or anti-colonialist, but because he was not bound by the strategic trajectory that held the capitalists together even when they were in friendly contention. Trump's ascension to the presidency and his actions since then represent the first all-out assault on the very foundation of Atlanticism, which again achieved its rationale and definition in opposition to Soviet Russia. This is where it comes from. Trump has attacked the relevance of NATO and the United Nations, engaged in flirtations with Russia, and has demanded that the traditional U.S. allies begin to pay their way militarily and renegotiate their trade relations with the U.S. These are not merely the egotistical ranting of a billionaire simpleton, not merely that. They represent an attempt at a major reorganization of international white power and America's place in it. While the split among the ruling class during the 2016 presidential election exposed the differences among the Atlanticists, it revealed that the Trump regime was an existential threat to their collective well-being under the existing setup. They had all determined to make it impossible for Trump to govern, at least for now. The unity of Trump's opponents is increasingly fragile, as Trump provides payoffs to individual sectors of the opposition, such as monumental tax breaks for the wealthy and all of occupied Jerusalem for Jewish capitalists and others who benefit from the reorganization of the Middle East under imperialist domination. Also, the contradictions within the Atlanticist arrangement have been understated by the ruling class for some time now. Trump has driven the contradiction to the surface, and with it, a realignment of political and economic forces within the U.S. Some forces are growing or receding in significance, and others, like Trump himself, have been introduced to pronounced respectable significance for the first time. Hence, the intra-capitalist war for control of the state continues unabated. Each U.S. presidential election retains residual state influence from previous regimes. Some, like the Bush regime, have gone so far as to create their own separate intelligence organizations. There is also talk of Trump creating an intelligence organization headed by Colonel Oliver North. North played a similar role for the regime of U.S. President Ronald Reagan during the illegal war against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua and in the CIA-orchestrated drug importation and distribution within the U.S. domestic African colony. So Trump was looking at Oliver North, to head up some kind of intelligence apparatus that was directly controlled by him. And Bush did a similar thing. I forgot what the entity that was called that Bush created because they couldn't trust the state apparatus as it existed. This thing that you hear now talking about the deep state, etc., it's real. The state is real. But I think what they are saying now and about the state is something that I think we've recognized for a long time. The state will always work in the interest of the social system. Regardless of who it is that's in power at any given moment, the state will function to preserve the relationship that imperialist white power has to the rest of the world. It assassinates, it will assassinate, it will on its own. The state will move to eliminate a leader or ruler, even in the United States government. It's done it before. We saw assassinations of Kennedys. We saw the assassination attempt of George Wallace, how he was, affecting a certain kind of chance. We saw the coup that was made against Nixon, the coup that was made against Spiro Agnew, his vice president. We've seen the stuff that's going on, the state moving to protect the status quo, to protect the arrangement that has already existed, and sometimes it will go against even somebody who's head of the government. And you mustn't mistake the government and the state for being the same thing. Because sometimes it can be pretty much the same thing, but the state is that entity that is always, it's the coercion. The state functions, and we see the state even in the party. The state is that entity that makes the stuff happen, that is responsible for the machine working all the time. And the state has the ability to make look good or bad anybody who is in the government. The state is that arm that is the real arm of coercion. And when you have a perfect alignment or a good alignment, the state will function like the government, but sometimes it won't. And you've got the state entity that's been there for different governments have come and gone, but the state is always there. And that's the thing that must be understood and has not been understood by a lot of people. So, and the state has the guns. In final analysis, that's the determinant factor. I don't care how much, goose pimples you get singing the Star Spangled Banner and what have you. The state has the guns, and that's the determinant factor. So, so we say, however, Trump has waged an outright public war against organizations of the state that are not under control of his regime. The most obvious example has been Trump's furious fight with the FBI, CIA, and other intelligence fronts after they all embellished or distorted the story of improper Russian intervention in the 2016 election. Remember, before all of this talk about impeachment for Biden's, for trying to get the President Zelensky of Ukraine to become an instrument of his re-election campaign by exposing the criminality of the Bidens, he was being investigated for almost 2 years by Mueller, the so-called Mueller, the special investigator. That was to show how the Russians really won the election for Trump. And this wasn't necessarily something that they really wanted to prove happened, but they wanted to do everything ongoing to undermine the ability of Trump to govern. And so if, in fact, the Russians are the ones who are responsible for his election and not the will of the people, in fact, he shows that the will of the people has been undermined by the Russians intervening in our perfect election system. And it's perfect as long as you're not a black person trying to vote in Birmingham, or as long as you don't live in Chicago where even dead people vote, right? So, they hold up this fanciful notion, and what's interesting is because you got left-wingers and everybody pumping the same kind of nonsense out about how the Russians really won the election and not Trump, et cetera. So, and so Trump has been fighting against all these agencies of the state. So it has been suggested by some that Trump is motivated by a private economic arrangement he has in Russia, or by fear of exposure by Russian intelligence agencies of licentious activity during a pre-election visit to Russia. Trump may also recognize the effectiveness of his enemies in undermining his ability to govern is directly connected to the perception they have created that his election victory was a consequence of Russian intervention. Whatever the case, by the way, I wanted to say that I heard some person who's supposed to be like this intellectual Du Boisian scholar, who was talking about how Trump, he really came out extolling Trump because Trump was anti-war. You're making a mistake with Trump. Trump is anti-war. He wants to end the wars. He wants to do all this other kind of thing, and that's why they're attacking Trump. This is what this guy was saying. This is what I mean in terms of having just a shallow analysis. You can't understand this. That's why people can't understand how the party moves at a particular time, because our analysis is not based just on what appears to be happening right now. We understand the basis of what is happening right now, and that's what informs us. So we say that whatever the case, his openness to a potential U.S.-Russia partnership has caused no little consternation among the Atlanticists who stand to lose trillions of dollars in political control in Europe and increasingly in the Middle East because of Russian reascendancy on the world stage. Even Obama's failed Asian pivot from Europe to contend with China's growing economic and political influence appears not to have shaken the Atlanticists as much as Trump's threatened embrace of Russia, characterized by U.S. pundits as our adversary. Russia is. And the thing is that there are a group of hungry capitalists who want to have this relationship with Russia. And this places them in contention with the existing setup, because Russia has to be isolated for some of the capitalists, the Atlanticists, to be able to continue their profit-making domination of the world. And so you got these new hungry capitalists. And if you look at what's happening with Trump administration, you got Manafort, who was connected to the Russians. You got, I forgot the guy, the other guy who was in his cabinet who had to leave because he was connected to the Russians. You have all of these forces. These are hungry, on-the-make capitalists, and they want to upset this whole thing by entering full-fledged as leaders of the imperialist world through this rearrangement especially as Russia is concerned. It's really something that you need to understand because it's got nothing to do with you. This whole thing about them getting rid of Trump has nothing to do with you. If they loved you, they'd be dealing with the police murders. They'd be dealing with what's happened to the Mexicans and indigenous people. They'd be dealing with what happened to oppressed peoples around the world. They don't give a damn about that. They just give a damn about maintaining the status quo. And this contest that they're having with Trump is a contest between different sectors of the bourgeoisie for control of the state that did not get resolved with the election itself. It didn't get resolved, so they're redoing it. They're doing a reworking of the election with the impeachment crisis. We're doing everything they can to minimize Trump's ability to govern. This is not a pro-Trump statement I'm making. This is just an objective thing about what it is that we're looking at, and we need to understand it. As this political report is being written, the Trump regime is under investigation by a special counsel for allegations of collusion with Russia in the 2016 presidential election. There is an obvious attempt by a collaborative bourgeois effort to undermine Trump's ability to govern and to remove him from office if necessary. Some have even suggested involvement by the British MI6 intelligence arm in the exposure of Trump's alleged collusion with Russia. People have forgotten that one of the things that brought this thing about the Russian involvement in the election was supposedly like some kind of tip that they got from this former British intelligence guy who did a report. Somebody, you may have forgotten that, but it was British, it was MI6. It's this guy, a British guy. And this is because of the kind of arrangements that had emerged within the Atlanticist group that really contributes to our understanding of the state, the capitalist state being an international entity. It's not just some kind of domestic thing that's happening here. There are daily allegations, some without any legal basis, of impropriety by Trump and or those close to him. Along with the manner in which Trump waged his campaign, this serves to tarnish the well-constructed fiction of U.S. governmental high-mindedness and presidential integrity. The fact that Trump campaigned as an outsider meant that he had to campaign against the system itself, the system that had disillusioned so many people through the obvious duplicity of traditional politicians. Trump campaigned against a system that is no longer able to stanch the struggles of the world's peoples, whose oppression allows ordinary white colonizers the psychological benefit of whiteness, even when the economic benefits are not so obvious. And this is what has thrown some people off, because they say, well, why do these white people always vote against their own interests? Because Trump is fighting not just for economic interests, he's fighting for the interests of whiteness, which is a really profound thing that must be understood. Ronald Reagan could mobilize the poorest sectors of the white population. They love him today because he fought for whiteness. And that's one of the auxiliary or the accessories, if you will, of the domination of imperial power. And it helps us to understand that capitalism, white power was born as capitalism, and all of the ancillary, I guess you would call it, benefits of that, including the psychological and emotional and spiritual stuff that comes with it. Trump has continued to wage a fierce fight back against his colonial capitalist contenders. Even as his attacks on the intelligence agencies within the U.S. are causing obvious unease for some imperialist apologists, Trump has also worked incessantly to destroy the myth of a neutral, disinterested bourgeois media working for the benefit of all the people. Trump's term, fake news, has become accepted lingua franca even within the respected media platforms of the ruling class. The intra-ruling class airing of dirty laundry is tarnishing and undermining the carefully constructed bourgeois myth of a noble white power working in the general interest of the world's peoples. The old adage, your actions speak so loudly I can't hear a word you say, is conspicuously applicable here. There are no good guys in this struggle, neither the Democrats nor Republican parties. Not the Democratic Party disguised as the millions of white women who are declaring Me Too, but who are more than 160 years later still unable to answer the question posed by Sojourner Truth, ain't I a woman too? Not the Democratic Party disguised as thousands of high school students marching against gun violence as long as the police murder of Africans and the U.S. murders of colonized peoples of the world are not mentioned. And we don't see these high school students marching when they talk about, you've got millions of students around the world marching against the environmental degradation, but they ain't marching in St. Petersburg, Florida, where the mayor has dropped more than 1 billion gallons of sewage into the water system. Not the Second Amendment defenders, nor the Democratic and Republican protectors of the FBI, who are outraged at alleged Russian intervention in quote-unquote, our elections, the finest examples of democracy, as long as it does not include an African church in Birmingham, Alabama. The reputation of the office of the U.S. presidency and the most highly respected institutions of the U.S. are being sullied beyond repair. Never mind that Trump is currently successful in carrying out many of his programs with an electoral base hovering at 40% or below, or that his capitalist opponents are too cowardly to make a frontal assault on the Citadel. The fact is that there are millions of people within the U.S. and abroad who, while not organized to make a meaningful fight back, are nevertheless disgusted with the U.S. So you know, I wanted to go through this. There's much more in this that we should look at, we should read. But I just think it's important because we're seeing all this stuff in the news today about impeaching Trump and Trump, you know, escaping Mueller, you know, who would show that the Russians are the ones who are responsible for his election, being nailed with Ukraine. And the Ukrainian thing is directly tied to the Russian question, by the way, because the U.S. did the coup in Ukraine against someone who was favorable to Russia to put their own lackey in power, which has led to nothing but the worst kinds of corruption and what have you that the Biden family is now obviously connected with. But this whole taint of Russia and what the remaining vestiges of anti-Russian suspicions and hatred in the United States among the white people is something that really factors into this struggle. And the thing that the attack on the Atlanticist arrangement is something that that we are looking at here. So I think it's important for us to remember that the elections itself, the elections simply themselves simply serve as a non-violent contest between different sectors of the ruling class. 1, for control of the state. 2, usually that resolves the question of what forces will control the state, who the FBI, CIA, NSA, and all these other intelligence police organizations work for. It's usually resolved through elections, even on your local level, in your city of Chicago, your city, you know, Birmingham and Houston, Texas. The elections usually determines that. The guy comes in, gets a new police chief there who will set up a new arrangement of how the program, the strategy of policemen is going to happen, and that's why they come up with their cameras, you know, body cameras and all this other silliness and walk the streets like they do in St. Petersburg, Florida. And they can only do that because the movement is weak enough to chase them off the streets. But on every level, this is how the process works. But with this election of the United States, this fluke, as far as they are concerned, and the reason Trump was able to succeed is because the bourgeoisie took him as a joke from the beginning. And by the time they woke up to what's happening, he had won all the support from all these white people, which is why Trump can say even now, if you get rid of me, there'll be civil war in this country. And he's said it before, because all the white people, he's won them. And so they have to move in a fashion that not only undermines, they've been working to undermine Trump. Now they've got this thing about him working with Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, to get rid of, to win this election. Then on top of that, they've got the fact that Trump is talking about pulling out of Syria, and which, by the way, the reason that the U.S. did not prevail in Syria in absolute terms is because of Russian involvement there. And so you've got this now is something that you've got a more comprehensive unity with sectors of the bourgeoisie or even their representatives, Democrats and Republicans. Don't get out of Syria. Trump is making a mistake. Trump is doing all this stuff about Syria. They're coming at him from 1,000 different fronts of the bourgeoisie to neutralize him, to change his policies and things like that, and if possible, to get rid of him. And they've got Pence on the bench. He's warming the bench to replace Trump with somebody who they can work with and who will carry out their mission. That's what we're looking at. And that's what we should understand. But even as we look at that, we should really understand how the U.S. has undermined itself. This battle, this struggle. You know, people who will call themselves activists and what have you don't get it, the role of the people and the consciousness of the masses of the people and how that's affected by, you got the bourgeoisie at each other's throat, and they're dragging out dirty laundry with skid marks in the shorts, you know, all over the place that everybody can see. And people are actually internalizing this stuff, whether they're conscious of it, whether it's in the forefront of their consciousness or not, people see this. People see an American that is crippled, that has been weakened. In Afghanistan, after 18 years, they cannot crush that movement that the people have there. They see that the Bidens, you know, here you got all the Democrats, and not just Democrats, even papers like the Wall Street Journal, when they got Biden. Here you got the president of the Vice President of the United States goes into Ukraine and gets rid of, goes there to get rid of a so-called prosecutor, and all of them are crooks in Ukraine. And his son, Hunter, just happens to come to Ukraine too, and gets this lucrative position in an energy company of the Ukrainian government. And so that happened. And they're saying that it's unproven. What you got to prove? What do you have to prove? And so, I mean, like Hunter Biden is not just a regular white guy who just goes into Ukraine, and get this, the vice president of the United States is there overseeing. He becomes the vice lord. The vice president of the United States becomes effectively the vice lord in a Ukraine that has a government that has been put in power by the U.S. So yeah, that happened. And yes, Trump made a move to use the Zelensky government to get rid, to expose that. And yes, that's traditional. That's nothing new about that. That's the way the U.S. government works. You do what we say do, except Trump has been more blatant and open about it. So that's what's happening. So I just wanted to go through that, and we still have a few minutes that we can talk. And I do hope people are open to discussion, and let's talk about this. Uhuru.
Uhuru, let's meet our leadership chairman, Omali Yeshitela, for that powerful study. Uhuru. So it's now time to open up with questions from our audience and online viewers. We want to appreciate everyone who's tuning in live via Facebook and YouTube, and also appreciate all of your engagement. Please continue to invite your friends and family to the study and share widely to all your social media platforms. And we have a few comments as well as questions. We have people also tuning in from Richmond, Virginia, Boston, Massachusetts, Chicago, Illinois, St. Louis, Missouri, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Huntsville, Alabama, Clearwater, Florida, Miami, Florida, Ghana, London, UK, Rotterdam, Netherlands, Schiedam, Netherlands, Houston, Texas, Fort Myers, Florida, Germany, Atlanta, Georgia, and Atlanta, Georgia. Uhuru. So, Mamuni Banda Sina, watching live from Germany, thanks Chairman for the great work, and says revolution is the only answer for Africa and black men. Adam from Rotterdam commented, any political program that does not prescribe and call for revolution, does not address, denounce, target, and aim at removing capitalist exploitation at and from its roots cause is a cosmetic surgery. an attempt at preserving the status quo. Kevin Byers from Kokomo, India, left a comment and question. Chairman, all that you say is right and exact. However, are you stating that Trump doesn't need to be ridiculed and or impeached? I doubt he'll be impeached, but shouldn't we try to remove him? He is a clear and present danger, as are the others, and as have been his predecessors.
Uhuru, I think that's a great question because, yes, he's a clear and present danger. Yes, he should be ridiculed because you can't ridicule Trump without ridiculing the U.S. government. But I think that's one thing that we need to be clear on, that when we ridicule Trump, we have to see him as an agent of U.S. imperialism and imperialism in general, and not just this single person because, I mean, this is from India. When you look at what has happened, what were you saying? Indiana? Indiana. That's in Indiana. Kokomo, right? Yeah, I'm wondering where you got a Kokomo from India. I was just going to use the example of what the British and other imperialists did in India. You know, it was pre-Trump. And so, you know, while it's permissible for us to do that, that our real mission has to be to build our own capacity to liberate ourselves from the whole system. You can preoccupy yourself with Trump. You can become an anti-Trump person, which simply means that you end up supporting one sector of the bourgeoisie against another sector of the bourgeoisie. What we have to do is build our own capacity. So being against Trump is fine, only if it results in strengthening our struggle for becoming politically independent, rescuing Africa and African people, you know, and the working class. I mean, otherwise, you're just supporting one sector of the bourgeoisie against the other. Being against Trump does not make you significant. Even the Wall Street Journal has got people against Trump. They just fired somebody from Fox News because he didn't act anti-Trump enough. So the point is that you're really not distinguishing yourself being opposed to Trump or even ridiculing Trump. They do that every day on CNN and NSBC and all these other entities. But they are not trying to build the capacity for the liberation of African people under the leadership of the African working class. Uhuru. That's what we do. That's what you need to do, comrade. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Thank you for that, Chairman. We also have a comment. Oh, it's a question from Michael Asamoah in Ghana on YouTube. He commented, I want to join this movement. What chance do I have?
Your chances are pretty good if you want to make genuine revolution that will result in the total liberation of all of Africa, because there's not going to be a Ghana revolution as quiet as it's kept. That's what Nkrumah understood from Ghana when he moved with every fiber of his body to unite all of Africa and African people, and he even create a constitutional platform that stated that Ghana will never be free until all Africa is free, and that said that Ghana would submit to United Africa. Ghana would submit to United Africa. And so if you can fight for that, if you can recognize that Africans have no country, that's what we're fighting for, is our country, our independence, our Africa, our total liberation of black people around the world, and that if you can do that, you should connect with us, and we're waiting for you. We're waiting for you, comrade. We're here. Well, I'm not waiting, but we're in motion, and want you to be able to join and also understand that the struggle for liberation is not just a discussion or conversation. We're having a relatively easy and calm discussion here, but we have to work on every front. On every front where African people are located, we have to have African internationalists who are distinguished by the fact that whatever profession we may have, whatever occupation we may have, our profession is revolution. And that that will involve sacrifices and discipline and what have you. And if you're able to do those things, then, like I said, we're waiting for you. Uhuru, we're here for you. So just contact us. Use the Facebook or YouTube, or go to APDEP. Oh, there's a link in the comments for you. Some smart person has done that. Uhuru.
So we have Ali Aiello in Boston. She left a comment and question. Uhuru Chairman, I've heard people say that Trump has increased the number of hate crimes in the U.S. and has allowed white nationalists to have a more prominent stature. Is this actually true, or does the media is the media now covering this more? And is overt white nationalism something that we will see more as the crisis of imperialism deepens?
Well, let me just say that crime is a legal definition. I mean, the hatred against African people in this country is something that's exemplified all the time in the various policies in the city, in Boston, where you're located, and the crimes, what we would characterize as crimes against African people, or hatred against African people, is made manifest by all these policies, everywhere we are located. And I think that Trump has created a situation where there's more naked, more open, and more openly, white nationalists are more capable of openly exposing their hatred of African people. And I think that is true, that Trump has done that. I think you'll see a certain kind of aggression from ordinary white people that you haven't seen in a long time, based on some assumptions made manifest by Trump. And I hope it wakes Africans up. But so that is true. And, you know, yes, you bring all of the white nationalists out of the closets and things like that. They have on their their camouflage outfits, and some of them are openly carrying weapons with, you know, an undisguised intent to use them against African people. But this was going to, remember, the preppers predated Trump. These guys who were out in the woods running around camouflage and everything, now they have been given permission to come to the surface, and you want them to the surface. I want them to the surface where they can be seen and dealt with. And I want them, but I would remind us that the ideological foundation of this whole capitalist system is rooted in white nationalism. So ordinary white school teachers, white nationalists, and whether they belong to organizations or not, they're sometimes more dangerous because they facilitate what these other forces will do. And we talk about Trump, and Trump, in some ways, Trump is helpful. It's helpful if we are organized. It's not helpful if we're not organized, but because this whole discussion, like the Mexicans, you know, this assault on the Mexican people, the nasty things he said about the Mexicans and other people, it brings to the surface for me, and it should for other people too, that Trump, his talk about a wall is minor league stuff. I mean, they stole Mexico. They stole more than half of Mexico. That's not even being discussed, but it creates the ability for us to have this discussion. And we never could have had this discussion with Bernie in place or Hillary, something like that. It would have been much more difficult to have this. So Trump is a problem, and I'm not denying that. But what I'm saying, the greater problem is our lack of organization and ideological clarity. We get the ideological clarity in the organization, we can handle this thing because it's going to happen whether Trump is there or not. The crisis of imperialism makes certain kinds of things necessary. Trump simply becomes the instrument that we're looking at now. I remember when McCain was running for president, and he was running against Obama in the last election, and people were saying that you had to vote for Obama, otherwise fascism was going to descend on this country. And and so McCain was the guy that time. And we keep finding ourselves in this situation where what motivates us is fear, as opposed to like some kind of analysis and program of our own. We got an analysis, we got a program, and it's not fear. And we are fighting for the total liberation of every inch of the African continent and the unification of Africa and African people around the world. We believe that the ability to have a socialist world will come about essentially because of the location and role of African people around the world in destroying our relationship with imperialism. That's the basis for a real new world economy that is a socialist world economy under the leadership of the African working class and other workers of the world. Uhuru.
So we have a question from Mort in Richmond, Virginia, who asks, should African peoples in U.S. Militias for community defense and community service like the Black Panther, should African people in the U.S. form militias for community defense and community service like the Black Panther Party? What is the best way to start?
Well, you shouldn't do it like the Black Panther Party. Black Panther Party was really a great propaganda instrument for our movement. People stood up with these weapons at a time where we were looking on television on a regular basis with police putting water hoses on Africans and brutalizing us without any kind of consequences. There should be consequences, but it shouldn't be like the Panthers. And I want to disagree with some folk who feel like parading with guns and what have you is the best stance. I mean, there might be some rationale, some logic to having these, again, as propaganda instruments to mobilize the spirit and consciousness of resistance of the people. But if we are serious about making a revolution, we are not going to be parading down the streets with damn guns. Because if we are serious about making revolution and armed struggle, it's going to be guerrilla war. And that means that that the oppressor won't even know where we are most of the time. That's how that happens. So you may have a situation such as in Ireland, where you had Sinn Féin, who was like a political formation on the one hand, that was connected directly to the Irish Republican Army for what that was worth. And then you had groups like the Irish Republican Socialist Party that was connected to the Irish Republican, whatever that armed entity was. I've forgotten the name of it at the moment. And so one was public and the other was not public. And so that kind of thing may happen. But I'm telling you, we're not going to make a revolution by openly running around with weapons. The state, those white militia forces that you see functions as arms of the state, even though they may be extra legal. And I'm not saying that when some threat is being made against our people at certain institutions that it will not be helpful for armed Africans to present ourselves to let the people know. I'm not saying that I'm against fighting and creating a military capacity and component of our forces who will be in every community where we are located when called upon, can defend the interests and advance the interests of the African Revolution. That is absolutely necessary. But I'm saying not like the Panthers. And that's not a put down on the Black Panther Party, because even the Panthers changed because they became targets by the bourgeoisie, and their attire and all of this stuff changed, and their methodology changed too, before the Panthers were effectively eliminated as a serious political contender in this country. Uhuru.
So I want to open it up for any questions in the audience, if anyone has anything. Well, because of time, we want everyone to know that if your question wasn't answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you and make sure that the chairman sees your question. This study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, Winning the War of Ideas. For your worldwide revolutionary news and analysis, you can visit theburningspear.com. And for revolutionary radio, dynamic shows, and music by Africans all around the world, tune in to Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via the Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. Did you unite with what you heard today and want to learn more about how you can get involved with the African People's Socialist Party? Visit apspuhuru.org for all information regarding how you can apply. Get Burning Spear Media's new limited edition poster, a reproduction of the front page of the historic December 1982 edition of the Burning Spear newspaper, featuring the cover of the first International Tribunal on Reparations for Black People. Get yours before they're gone at burningspearmarketplace.com. Pre-sales of the new limited edition Omali Taught Me t-shirt end soon. Support the office of the chair and help us reach our fundraising goal to launch Uhuru Wabinki, an initiative to build an independent African economy. Uhuru.
Uhuru Wabinki.
Yes.
Means Freedom Bank. That's what we're working on. We
It
want
is.
people to get the t-shirt.
Uhuru.
Go ahead,
So
Comrade.
get that Omali Taught Me t-shirt. And click the link in the description box to pre-order your shirt today. Quantities are limited, so you want to get them as soon as possible. And order your copy of Chairman Omali Yeshitela's latest book, Vanguard, The Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, the political report to the 7th Congress at burningspearmarketplace.com. The Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations is gearing up for our annual Black People's March on the White House. So we want you to check out this ad letting you know what's in store. Uhuru.
Now is the time to throw off all hesitation, open up new fronts of struggle, and to launch every protest, demonstration, and anti-imperialist action.
The Black is Back Coalition recognizes that it's not enough to call for peace. We call for 2, 3, many Venezuela.
From the ballot box to the barricades,
the boldest, newest vision, progressive platform that you will find out there in the world today.
as an act to deepen the crisis of imperialism.
This system is a foul social system born of slavery and genocide. It will never do anything for us.
Every protest against police and white civilian murder of our people.
Y'all think it's cool to kill black people and then get on paid leave?
These police, man, these pigs, they are everywhere in our community, everywhere.
County police, state police, you name it, if there's a police organization, it is here. Every mass mobilization to demand the end of the cruel, bloody economic war against Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Cuba, Iran, Korea, and Russia.
The other wars, not just the one that might send some white kid to some place in the Middle East, but all these other wars.
The protesters continued to circle Times Square.
The attack that the U.S. is planning to launch against Syria represents an overall attempt on the part of U.S. imperialism to maintain its control over that region of the world.
We have to give them a problem that they can only solve to benefit us. Do you understand?
The U.S. and all imperialist powers, new and old, must be expelled from Africa, and the U.S. domestic colonial occupation forces known as police must be driven out of our colonized communities as part of the struggle against colonialism and imperialism.
I'm a revolutionary. Let me just tell you that right up front. I'm a revolutionary. I think that you have to overturn the whole damn system before we will ever be free. But I recognize that everybody in here ain't revolutionary. We need activity and action by masses of people who've never heard of revolution, never thought about revolution, but they believe in something called justice.
Join the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations for our annual march on the White House in Washington, D.C. on November 2nd and 3rd. For more information, go to www.blackisbackcoalition.org.
Uhuru. All right, so our next announcement is sign up for the Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise taking place December 14th through 19th. The Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise is an annual fundraiser held to support the work of the African Socialist International. The African Socialist International is an organization made up of African people located virtually on every continent, dedicated to overturning the conditions faced by African people worldwide. You can enjoy political education on board with the chairman, on and off board excursions, and more food than you can eat. To book and make your deposits, you can visit uhurulegacycruise.org or call the travel agent Linda Stern at 732-972-4171. If you want to further support the ASI and the Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise, you can make a donation by visiting uhurulegacycruise.org. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in. We want to thank everyone for tuning in, and make sure that you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. Uhuru.